Hello, my name is Rich Lee. I'm a professor of psychology at the University of Minnesota, and I'm pleased to be able to speak with you today at the Rudd Summer Adoption Research Institute about how to publish adoption research. I'm going to draw on both my own experiences as a researcher who publishes on adoption, but also as a former journal editor and a frequent reviewer of manuscripts. So for this talk, I will discuss some of the strategies and challenges to publishing adoption research. I will specifically focus on researcher-editor biases, talk about some assumptions made about adoption, and address the privileging and often overlooked voices and narratives in adoption scholarship. Finally, I'll talk about different approaches to working with adoption communities and specifically make the case that adoption as a population is worthy of scientific study. And in doing so, I will talk about the ways that adoption is often used in research methodology. Let's start with the challenges often that come with publishing or trying to publish research on adoption or adopted populations. Let me ask you this rhetorical question. Do you consider publishing adoption research to be easier, harder, or not any different than publishing other kinds of research? Oftentimes, when people submit research that focus on adopted populations, reviewers will make the following kinds of critiques. A common one when studying a population and looking at their unique individual experiences, a common critique then is that the study lacks a theory or a model to understand the research question and the particular relevance to the population. Another question that often comes up is, what's the public health relevance to studying adoption? And that goes hand in hand with the fact that adoption, while increasing and common and seen throughout different sectors of society, it still represents a very small portion of the general population. And so oftentimes, reviewers will wonder about whether or not the findings are generalizable to other populations. A major critique that often comes up as well is that when researchers have to develop adoption-specific scales or methodologies in order to capture the adoption experience. Of course, because these are difficult to reach populations and samples, it's often difficult to run pilot studies where you first validate the measures prior to using it in your study. One reason for that is it's very difficult to recruit adopted families and individuals. And the samples are oftentimes on the smaller side. This is particularly difficult when you need to conduct a pilot study to validate a scale and then collect more data to test your research questions. Sometimes that's just not feasible. And so a scale is developed ad hoc or developed quite thoughtfully, but you are using it for the first time with the sample for which you're trying to answer research questions. Because sample sizes often are small, another concern or critique that's often brought up is whether or not the study is statistically underpowered. And finally, a common critique that can come up is whether this research is programmatic, or is it too isolated or unique at trying to address one issue without much follow-up. But to understand these critiques, what I want to argue is that we need to first sort of step back and really think about how we're approaching the research to begin. First off, I'd like to challenge people who are interested in adoption research on understanding what are their motives. What are your motives? Why are you studying adoption? Are you studying adoption because of a personal connection? Are you studying adoption because it's a convenient, accessible population, or there's an opportunity presented to you, but perhaps you have no real understanding or background knowledge about adoption? Or are you studying adoption because as a graduate student, you happen to be in a research laboratory or working with an advisor who is already doing this research? And so you are trying to then find a way to answer your particular research questions using this sample. Another motivation oftentimes for studying this population is simply curiosity. Maybe you read an article, you had some sort of encounter, or there was a question that seemed like an adopted population would be the best way to try to answer the question. But it was just a natural intellectual curiosity with the community and the population. Another reason may be that adoption may be actually the best study design or the best methodology in order to test your research question. And we'll get a little more into that later. The other thing I want us to think about are what are the beliefs and assumptions that researchers hold? What do you, someone interested in doing research on adoption, actually know about the adoption experience? What perspective are you taking when you have begun this research? How do you know what you know about adoption? Do you see adoption from a deficit perspective? Do you see adoption as a humanitarian effort that involves the rescuing of children? When you think of adoption, do you think about how adoptees should have gratitude and feel blessed to be living in a loving family? When you think about adoption, do you think of the specialness of adoption and the fragility of people who've experienced such adversity, neglect, hardship? Or do you look at adoption and think of the resilience of these children and adults? Because of course, adoption is a lifelong journey. It's not a singular event. And do you see adoption as a wonderful example of resilience? It's really important, in my opinion, that researchers think carefully about their motives, their beliefs, and their assumptions. Are their motives genuine and ethical? Are their beliefs and assumptions correct and valid? Are these beliefs and assumptions taking a deficit approach? Is it looking at adoption as a positive win-win? Or is it understanding adoption as a complicated and often ambiguous lifelong journey? Most adoption research, in my experience as both an editor, reviewer, and researcher, tends to center the voice of adoptive parents, adoption agencies, and to some extent, researcher curiosity. If you look at all the big names in adoption research, many of them are in fact adoptive parents, although that positionality is not necessarily stated up front. And on that point, I should note that I myself am not an adopted person, although my family does have adoption in its history. Specifically, my wife is an individual who was adopted from South Korea as a child. Adoption researchers also are often sponsored or supported or affiliated with adoption agencies. And a question then arises in terms of whose interest is being served, whether the researcher is an adoptive parent or the researcher is supported or affiliated with an adoption agency. And when researchers are simply curious, how does that curiosity manifest in the types of narratives being perpetuated and sustained? My question for adoption researchers is always who's speaking for the adoptee in the adoption community? And to what extent is that a researcher's responsibility to make sure that the adoptee perspective in particular is accurately and fully represented? And then I think it's important, as I mentioned already, to consider what are the motives, beliefs, and assumptions of these different privileged voices, particularly when researchers are themselves adoptive parents or supported and affiliated with adoption agencies. Oftentimes, the adoptee and the birth family perspective and voice is overlooked in this research for the reasons I already just mentioned. From a narrative perspective, then, the question is, what is the master narrative that gets perpetuated in adoption scholarship? And what are the alternative narratives that are being overlooked? I argue it's critically important that we actively involve the adoption communities in the scholarship being done. And so I ask you, as students and early career researchers, how involved are you with the adoption community being studied, and whose voice and narratives are being represented in your scholarship and publications? One thing to think about as you examine or explore getting more involved in the adoption community is really what are the barriers and challenges to entering a collaborative relationship. This is where community-based participatory research or participatory action research, such as YPAR, is really helpful, because looking at these CBPR or participatory action research principles force us as scholars to think about power dynamics, to think about to what extent is the research we're engaged in top down or bottom up from the community? How much of a say does the adoption community have in the way the research is conducted, and the questions that are asked, and the measures being administered? And we need to then think about, how can we employ successful strategies to ensure that the collaboration is balanced, is fair, and is respectful. So I'd like to talk a little bit about adoption as a population of interest. I would argue there's kind of two ways that research is often done. You could either study adoptees and adoptive families as the population of interest, and from there, deeply interrogate the adoption experience from all perspectives. And to look at the adopted experience, much as you might look at the immigrant experience or the refugee experience, or the experience of racially minoritized individuals, or other communities that often are not part of the master narrative, right? So when we think of adoption as the population of interest, we need to push away from the master narratives of adoption as a win-win, as a humanitarian rescue, right? As adoptee, as grateful, and instead look at the complexity of adoption, right? The positive experiences of adoption, and the challenges that come with being adopted and growing up. And how are these experiences then informing the types of psychological phenomena of interest? For example, when studying adoption, we can study adoption as a singular event and look at sort of developmental trajectories of adopted individuals, or we can think of adoption as a lifelong journey in which different feelings and thoughts emerge over time, such as the extent to which they think about their birth family and how do they try to answer questions about their birth family at different developmental periods in their life. We also need to think about how adoption is often used as a research methodology. Adoption is often framed as a wonderful way to conduct what some would call a natural experiment, where you can, for example, compare someone, two twins, one of whom is raised in the biological family, one of whom is placed for adoption, and then begin to understand, right, the interaction or the interplay between gene and environment by using the adoptive family as a different environmental influence on how gene expressions may occur, right? How phenotype may play out. That's adoption as a natural experiment. Adoption also is often employed, particularly in developmental science, as a natural intervention, understanding how prior to adoption, children often are raised in institutional care or orphanages or foster families where living conditions are often not ideal. And children may experience neglect, abuse, deprivation of various sorts. And they don't have a stable family home environment in which to grow. But after adoption as a natural intervention, oftentimes researchers are interested in what Michael Rudder and others have called developmental catch-up, right? The extent to which a child is able to rebound and their developmental trajectory sort of moves back up to be comparable to peers who did not grow up in an adopted, in an institutional setting. These are valid approaches to using adoption as a research methodology. But what I want to argue is that is the adopted experience itself still being considered beyond just as a research methodology to answer other kinds of questions. I think it's important as scholars that we always think about the adoption experience itself, not as a singular event, but as a lifelong journey. So going back, when we think about these common critiques, we have to think about our motives, our assumptions, and our beliefs, and we need to think about how we typically approach the adopted experience, right? Both in terms of the population that we're studying and trying to understand the complexity of adoption as a lifelong journey, and also when we think about adoption as a convenient research methodology. So what I want to argue is that we need to employ what my collaborator, Adam Kim, who himself is a Korean adoptee, what he and I have argued is that we need to employ more of a critical adoption studies perspective. And in the case of the work that we do on Korean adoption, the way in which critical adoption studies and Asian Americanist psychology sort of come together, right, to provide a different approach towards studying adoption. And I would encourage that as early career researchers, you really begin to understand critical theories that are relevant, particularly critical adoption studies, but also other kinds of critical theories. For example, many adopted individuals have different types of disabilities. And so then it's a matter of looking at both adoption from a critical adoption studies perspective, but also from a critical disability studies perspective, right? And looking at the sort of systems level, right? The history of adoption and the way in which adoption as a system and in our society has played out, and how that informs the individual and family adoption experience, right? So the first thing that's important, as I've already mentioned, is that we need to understand, we need to learn about adoption history, both in the receiving country, in the case of international adoption, so the United States, for example, but also in what often is referred to as the sending country or the birth country, right? In my case of research, understanding the history of adoption in South Korea. How did that emerge as a practice in social welfare? What were the alternatives to adoption prior to this point in time? Why did adoption suddenly become formalized and legalized? And how did international adoption become part of that social welfare set of practices in South Korea? And then why was international adoption suddenly popular and in the United States? How did that occur in the context of the larger social political history of this country? And then how does this overlay with or interplay with race, gender, sexuality, and so forth? So we need to understand adoption history, and we need to use that to inform how we study, how we ask questions about the adopted community. Also, critically important is that we need to center the adoptee voice. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of adoption research privileges adoptive parents or adoption agencies, either because researchers themselves are affiliated or are adoptive parents, or those voices, those powers, right? People with greater privilege and power are pushing the narrative for which researchers adopt. I argue it's critically important that the adoptee voice is uplifted, just as more emerging scholarship is starting to happen, looking at centering the voice of birth families, birth parents. And often we center the connection or the experience of birth mothers, but I would argue also birth fathers, right? And siblings, and elevating these other aspects of the adoption triad that often are either referenced as a side note or just altogether not considered. And by doing so, then we begin to shift the narrative. The master narrative begins to be replaced with alternative narratives, recognizing that there's not one narrative that occupies all the space of adoption. So in my work, I have begun to do some of this centering of the adoptee voice and the shifting of narrative by taking the scholarship I do and bringing it to the public in a new novel way, specifically through comics. This is one example of helping people who may not be familiar with transracial, transnational adoption to begin to understand sort of that lived experience through this character on the left, who here is referred to as Charlotte. And Charlotte is on the swings having a conversation with her good friend Chloe. And here Charlotte talks about having been discriminated and bullied by the neighborhood because she's a Korean adoptee, and how this played out with the other Korean adoptee growing up in the same town. And here, what's nice is that we really tried to demonstrate how Chloe, as her friend, can provide support and allyship and solidarity with Charlotte's experiences. This is a comic that emerged from a lot of conversations I've had with adopted individuals in the community and their distaste for the phrase gotcha day, which is often used for celebrating the day a child who'd been adopted by a family is legally received into that family. And here we talk about how in our qualitative work, oftentimes adoptees will mention how gotcha day makes them feel less like a person and more like an object. And it also is a constant reminder of the fact that there was another loss that occurs when a person is adopted, the loss of their first family or birth family. This is a unique gendered experience of how adoptees, often, particularly adopted girls, cisgender girls, are often seen in a sexual light. And in this case, when people confuse the adopted daughter as their father's wife. As adopted individuals get older, they also engage in a lot of exploration of their cultural heritage. And this includes finding ways to reclaim their identity and their culture. And so for this case here, you see how Charlotte now is contemplating changing their name to their Korean name, Younghee, and how complicated and challenging that is, particularly for the adoptive family who may have deeply invested in the name that they had chosen for their child. And also here, in conversation with a Korean American who's not adopted, contrasting that with the fact that for children of immigrants raised in their families, that that's a privilege not to have to think about the name they want to use in this way. In this comic here, it gets at another way in which adoptees often are trying to better understand both their family history, but also their medical health history. And so here, Younghee now is talking with her good friend Diggy about genetic testing. And this is actually from a series. I'm just highlighting one of the panels. And finally, this here talks about how adoption is still used politically. And this gets at the critical adoption studies angle that is so important for us to understand as adoption scholars. And so when Justice Barrett, during one of the Supreme Court cases, suggests that women who are pregnant should just pursue adoption rather than abortion, it clearly speaks to her privileged position as an adoptive parent without looking at critically examining the systemic inequities that have created these difficult sort of situations for people. And so I hope what I've done, as I've talked about, the challenges with publishing adoption scholarship, is forcing you as scholars to step back. And part of what makes oftentimes publishing so challenging is that we do it naively. We approach the topic naively without critically thinking about the adoption experiences from all angles and thinking about alternative narratives that are critical to examine. And so what I recommend is that we proactively address these critiques by immersing ourselves in the history and scholarship of critical adoption studies. And that by doing so, we are able to better address the critiques proactively, whether it's measurement issues or sampling size or the type of exact study design we use. The other thing then is we need to oftentimes have to connect the dots for the editor and the reviewer. We can't assume that they understand the perspective and the history of adoption. So in our writings, we have to connect those dots. And that is something that needs to happen, particularly if an editor or set of reviewers adopt the master narrative approach to understanding adoptions. That we need to do a little extra work in justifying our critiques and our positions. When we do that, we also have to recognize that sometimes we're not going to publish in the big mainstream journals, that sometimes we have to publish in specialty journals or population-specific journals. And so we need to find the right journal. And in that process, if you go on the academic market and you are up for tenure and promotion, it's important to educate your promotion and tenure committee about the challenges that come with adoption scholarship and how sometimes the type of work you do is not best suited for in these mainstream traditional journals and are better suited for these specialty journals or population-specific journals. And finally, I want to end by imploring us all to always remember that we should never sell out adoptees just simply for a publication, that their perspective, their experiences should be honored and respected, and that the research we do really needs to be uplifting their experiences, whether those are the joys of adoptees finding love and raising families, or the uncertainties of an adoptee searching for their birth family, or the frustrations and the support they seek from their adoptive family. But however we approach this work, it's critical that the adoptee perspective is amplified and respected in that what we're doing. And that we're able to then somehow find ways to give back to that community. And the work I'm doing now, often we see that playing out with this comic, where many of the findings, I'm trying to then communicate that through the comic, Other Ones by Lee. So that's all I have to share with you today for this presentation, but I look forward to the questions that you have for me. Thank you.